Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Dan.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is David Lab.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick
I'm
Gillette.
Christopher
This is
Knopf.
Dr. Bob Greenberg.
I'm Laird Hamilton.
Cool. This is Dr. Rich Ledet. I'm a professor at Troy University in Troy, Alabama. The views that I'm about to express are my own. They are not the views of my university. And today, Pete and I are going to be talking about the ethical pitfalls of female engagement in conflict zones on The Break It Down Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Well, there you go. It's Saturday morning. You and I have been diddly-dallying on the internets trying to communicate because if anyone's ever been a Luddite, it's for sure you.
Yeah.
But we got it all figured out, and it's always fun to talk to you. The last time you were on the show, we had just elected President Trump, so that means it's been well over a year since we've actually recorded a conversation, and that's entirely too long.
We did a brief follow-up, and I think I talked about democratic citizenship.
That's right. That's right. You have to tolerate, educate, and participate if you're going to be doing these things. And actually, I'm interested to hear what you think. We're going to talk to Yasha. Well, he's an author. He's a political scientist from Harvard, and he's talking about liberal democracy. So we're going to have him on the show. And it'll be interesting either to get you two together or compare and contrast notes because you guys are both from the same field. And he's talking about the erosion of liberal democracy as a form of government and how we're moving away towards more, I don't want to say totalitarian things because I'm out of my depth and it's more your depth, but we're going to talk to him soon about that and kind of figure out what the heck we're doing.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of different kinds of democracy, as it turns out. There's not just one model.
Right.
So I bet he'll use big concepts like rule of law.
He does talk about the rule of law. He does. It's I've been reading through the book. He talks about rule of law quite a bit and talks about how the liberalness, the open, and that isn't in terms of like left or right liberal. That's
right. That's a key thing you have to mention because people get thrown out of whack when you use that word liberal.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to talking to him and definitely hoping to either get you two together at some point or, again, follow up with the show. So it's good. But today, our prime topic is our paper that we have written and is essentially published in a journal. What journal did we publish this thing in?
Well, it's not in print yet, so it's still in press. Journal of Military Ethics. Well, it's been accepted for probably close to a year now, but, these things take time. Academic publishing takes time. The peer review process takes time.
Yeah.
But we were able to get this through peer review, so, we're all pretty proud of it. And we actually have an interesting co-author, my wife and partner.
Yeah.
Who her and I do a little bit of writing. So we're very proud of this piece, waiting for it to come out so I can hang it on my bulletin board.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because you got two giant white dudes writing about female empowerment, and your wife comes in and helps us out. But ultimately, the field work was done by us.
That's right.
She did, she was more of the strategic level editing, and hey, you knuckleheads, write more about this, less about that. So
yeah, well, she did some of the academic research that you and I weren't able to do or didn't have time to do.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a huge piece of what we needed because it's one thing to go, we saw this in the field, but yeah, you've got to tie it to the academic research, and she's definitely helped us do that.
Yeah. Well, and it speaks to some other things that we'll probably get into about how, you don't just want to have a bunch of dudes doing stuff.
Yeah.
Kind of helps to have an integrated team.
Right, and an approach that you actually have some skill to apply. I mean, so I talk a lot about, and partly because Rich and I've discovered these things, that the link between theory and strategy and policy and what happens at the tactical level, and then there's a level below that where it's visceral, it's real, it's the ground truth. So if you're on the ground, well, then there's no way to reliably and repeatably advance your policy and your strategic goals.
That's right. Well, there's one thing, and we start this off in the paper, and that's a good point to make, Pete, because start off with, David Kilcullen's famous 28 articles. His phrase, we have it in quotes in the beginning of the paper: engage the women, beware the children. And that was part of the DOD's strategy, right? Let's engage the women. But then what we saw on the ground, and actually what other academics saw on the ground, we rely on some ethnographic work that was done in Afghanistan. And basically what you see on the ground, engage the women might be nice in theory, but we really lack an understanding of what's happening on the ground. So it's hard to get that ground truth to line up with our strategic or even our theoretical approach here.
Yeah, the idea of engaging females requires that there's actual tactical ability to do that. One of the things we've seen is that though there's intention and there is a mechanism to engage females, there's no actual, even though there's this great intention to engage females, there's the problem that there's no tactical proficiency in this. So if a tank unit goes out and is going to fire tables and work on tank platoon maneuvers, there's all kinds of detail and minutia that you have to master to be able to qualify. And there's like an actual, like, you have done it, you are an effective tank commander, you are an effective tank unit. And you're going to go out and do these things in terms of female engagement, and that detail is gone. They don't treat it the same way as tank commanding or shooting artillery or small units maneuvering on a target or accompanying the defense. All these different things that you can master tactically at the National Training Center or joint training centers that are located around the world. We don't have that kind of clarity. It's just go engage females, and this is where we hold the military accountable. Talk a little bit about what your experiences are with the difference between because you started out as an 11 Bravo, an infantryman.
Yes, I did.
Now you're an academic who also gets to go out and see things. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, we can. I'll take this straight back to the paper, actually. Yeah, I mean, I was in 11 Bravo, and there were no women in my unit. I mean, there were some medics who were female. There was some people in the NBC unit that were female. But no, combat arms, this is mid-90s. We didn't, women still technically weren't allowed in combat. I could tell you that just the short amount of time I spent in Afghanistan, well, I saw women in combat. And I'll tell you another truth. There's some of those women I would take in combat over some men that I know any given day. So I think the military's kind of had to learn, and there was, learn by doing, if you will. But right. Especially at first and there's academic work that we reference in our paper that speaks to this as well, and other people who are in similar positions as Pete and I. There's evidence that, yeah, we tried to go and quote unquote empower women with female engagement teams, and the problem is we were very unprepared. Much in the same way that we, as you were just mentioning, we shoot tables, and we get that right. We didn't necessarily understand the cultural environment that we were stepping into. There's something that we discuss at length that we're building off of other scholars' work. Pashto is not just a language. Yeah. It's a way of doing things, and it's also a way of doing things. And there's a gender gap there within Pashto that, we only had a surface level understanding of, and we didn't really understand that gender relations in Afghanistan, and you could speak to Iraq. It's probably similar. The gender relations are defined by these nuances that are buried in culture that, just even if you're able to speak Pashto, I mean, there are different dialects of Pashto, but there are also some gray areas here within the culture that, we couldn't understand, especially at first, Yeah. And again, like I said, we reference plenty of academic work, as much as we can find, that speaks to this, that really addresses the gap between theory and practice. It's one thing to tell your units, even if you got a lot of women in your units, it's one thing to tell them to go and engage other women. but do they necessarily understand some of the nuances that we even observed?
Yeah, and this topic is not one for everybody in the audience, but for certainly it's something that we need to capture and put up so that there is another reference. Because one of the things we did experience was quite a bit of trouble finding all of the academic research because it is such a disparate field, and being able to link specifically to the literature that already exists was tough already. So this, if nothing else, is an effort to create another citable source and something that's consumable and maybe a little easier to find than some of the academic things. I want to talk a little bit about the other end of the challenge, and there's a lot of problems with this whole topic, and that's why we wanted to write a paper based on ethics, because our own ethos can get in the way of our own success. When we even bring this topic up, again, two big white dudes, when we're talking about women in conflict zones, one of the questions I often was asked, Rich, was and in a very, I don't want to use the word aggressive, but in a very direct way and in a challenging way, the females especially that I engage, you're talking about American females, would say, which women are you talking about? Who are you talking about? Like, whoa, hold on. This is an academic conversation, not a political one. But I often had to start on the defensive on something that shouldn't be defended.
Well, we, if you remember correctly, when we gave a talk based on this paper at the Command General Staff College a few years back, and the audience was mostly female. And it was, from my experience in academic conferences, that was one of the better conferences that I've ever been a part of. The audience really ran with our paper, and we had some great, I wouldn't even say feedback, because they, not directly to us, they were feeding back to each other. And that was a great experience, because it's not that we were trying to touch a nerve, but we were talking about something that was relevant to the people in the audience.
Yeah.
And it was also the biggest audience that I've ever spoken in front of at an academic conference. But dealing with this idea of ethos, and this is, we order the paper. We have 3 ethical pitfalls. The first one deals with our commanders. The second one deals with male leaders in conflict zones. And then we talk about the ethics, about the way we treat the women that we're trying to help, if you will.
Right.
So when you're asked the question, well, which women are you talking about? Actually, we're talking about all of us. We're dealing with the women that we're asking to go and be part of female engagement teams. And I do think that trying to keep up with this conversation as best I can on the academic side, and also trying to pay attention to what the military is doing, I think that the Department of Defense has gone to great lengths to try to get better at this, but without a higher level of conversation that's looking at theory, and let's look at the evidence and see how it's, maybe we need to adjust our operations a little bit. And that's really where we're coming in. And that's where we're trying to move this academic conversation forward, in hopes that we can have some, in the future, we could maybe have some evidence-based policy making, if you will.
Right.
When the question is which women are you speaking of, we're talking about all of them. We're trying to basically improve the way that we conduct these operations, but we're also trying to make sure that when we operate, particularly in Middle Eastern countries and Islamic, or countries that have governments based in a more in a less than secular manner, are we doing things that are culturally appropriate? Because if we're not, then we might actually be harming the very people that we're trying to help.
That's a great point. Let me jump in and back us up a little bit, and let's talk about a couple of concepts. One, when we're talking about the ethos or the ethics of a commander, of a policy, whatever, we're saying ethics in the most basic way. This is right, this is wrong. One of the problems is in conflict zones, what seems to be an ethical thing creates an ethical dilemma where all the ethics don't line up. I'm going to give you a real quick example. Assuming that Army people who are deployed, and I'm saying Army, military, people who are deployed have some kind of requirement to defend against boys being raped by men or boys being co-opted into some sort of sexual relationship, it gets really tough. Of course, it's wrong to have men sexually abuse children, of course. But it's also wrong to put your patrol in jeopardy because you poison a relationship with someone because your judgment of their culturally accepted, and I'm on dangerous ground there, practice of doing these things. If you piss them off so much that you put your entire patrol into, and the point I'm trying to make now is that it's very delicate. And what we can do culturally is challenging. So these ethical things, it's not just right and wrong. It's in that specific context. And you and I both know, Rich, valley to valley, village to village, heck, compound to compound, you're going to have different rules for what you can and can't do. And so when we come in with a set judgment on ethos, you're going to have problems.
Well, it's and this is based on some of your observations, and again, this is something we put in the paper. You've got an all-male infantry platoon, and they're all of a sudden tasked with monitoring elections and determining the extent to which women are participating in the election. And it's not that the infantry platoon leader didn't want to do that, but when you've got an election monitor who was female and who wasn't familiar with the terrain, both physical and the human terrain. Oh man, I just used that term, human terrain. Oh my word, how did that slip out?
Yeah.
But you put that platoon in a bad position, and you're not, it's not that the platoon leader is afraid to get into combat, but you're asking somebody to put himself and his personnel in harm's way for a part of the mission that he's not necessarily trained for,
or a provisioned for. You're holding space, not looking to pick fights. Like he's got a specific mission, and this is again where this mission creep and even policy creep or policy bleed happens. Where people have these goals and they see a mechanism to accomplish their specific goal. So I'm going to use an example that's not so far afield. Let's talk about school shootings with kids. Okay, what's the goal? It's to make kids have a safe, healthy, non-terrifying learning environment. Does that mean that getting rid of AR-15s is the means to the end? I don't know, but it all of a sudden becomes that because a lot of us don't like assault rifles, and we have a problem with these kind of weapons being available. And what person needs that? Okay, you've bled policy across two different lines because I'm trying to keep kids safe. I'm thinking about ballistic sheetrock and other things that we can do to make sure that kid is safe. I'm talking about trying to figure out what it takes for a school resource officer to properly cover a school.
You're thinking in those terms, and while you're saying that, I'm thinking about mental health.
Exactly.
What are we doing about improving, our mental health services so that we maybe avoid these kind of, situations to begin with.
Right. So instead of talking about something that's actually going to keep your kids safe and not terrified the entire day at school, we've now moved into some kind of redefining the Second Amendment. Like, whoa, hold on. We just jumped tracks. And they're akin, but that's not going to get you a healthy. You can't reliably say, just say right now in Pete and Rich's magical world, we eliminated the Second Amendment and nobody had the right to do that. Okay, you now have 1,000 other problems to deal with that have very little to do with keeping a kid safe at school.
Yeah, and I'm still wondering why we don't have that well-regulated militia that everybody's involved in, because Second Amendment's pretty clear about that.
Yeah. So, and here we go, right? We're off on the races and not talking about, what kids need and how to provide mental health and understanding all these things. This is the same thing that happens when we have an idea like female engagement and what it takes to get this stuff right.
the path to good policy is not easy, you know. And when you've got an objective like let's try to improve the lives of women in, you know, Afghanistan. Well, that's great. That's a wonderful objective. But if you're not willing to do the hard work of figuring out what it's going to take and understanding there's going to be, you know, some things you learn along the way, but if you don't learn those lessons, you know, going back to what I mentioned earlier, you're going to be actually hurting some of the people that you're trying to help, and you could actually set back progress and political development. Because if I use the word progress, some people might jump on me. You might actually hinder the process of political development, because I'm convinced that, you know, the Afghan males that I worked with, it's not that they want their women completely, you know, stuck in the compound the whole time. They have the capacity to progress. They have the capacity to develop, you know, and if we let them, or if we maybe, you know, partner with them in a way that we haven't, you know, and again, I want to say, I do think the military has learned some of the lessons, but you don't just say, hey, you're a woman, go talk to other women, without giving them the tools necessary to understand the cultural nuances that are necessary to make these things happen. You know, we spend some time, you and I spent a lot of time working with one key village elder. And this guy was a district governor, and he had military history, he had an academic history, he was a religious elder. And this guy had daughters. He had multiple daughters. And he wanted his daughters to have a better life than his wife had. But at the same time, if you can't understand that he has a responsibility as a male in his culture, right? If you can't help him, you know, or bring about the conditions that are favorable to him to do his job, culturally speaking, how are we ever going to take the next step? Or how can we expect him to help other elders, you know, take the next step, because they want lives to be better for their children, regardless if their children are male or female.
That's a universal truth.
That was one thing I learned very, very quickly when I was on my deployment. Like, at the end of the day, these people are just like me. They just want life to be better for their children.
Let's back up real quick, because I want to make sure we sort of hit some marks that we've got to get to, because we'll definitely do this. Power right through everything. So another part of this policy creep where we shift tracks, of course, we all understand the data indicates that females are raising kids, and the longer the kids stay in school, the better they do. The more empowered the females are, the better the kids will perform, the more calm the nation is. And so you're trying to, the idea is that if we can start to empower females and get them out and producing in society in a different way, we will have a positive net outcome for them, for us, for the world. The problem is you can't be so passionate about this. It's all the consequences be damned. And that seems to be, and I'm going to hold the women accountable on this, they get so driven towards accomplishing this very simple concept that they lose the complexity of actually pulling that off, like you've said a couple of times, in a way that doesn't actually cause more harm. Where this policy and the tactics created actually pull you further away from your goal of empowerment. So the whole lesson with this is, when Dr. Rich and Pete say female empowerment, a lot of women lose their minds. Women are already empowered. Like, whoa, easy. We're trying to use words to describe something that's very complex. Empowerment is a good word if you use it. Sort of like liberal democracy. Doesn't mean left democracy. So in this terms, we're talking about, if we're going to empower women and give them access to more things, we are giving them a different kind of power. So,
well, here's a good example. You talk about liberal democracy, and as a scholar who studied democracy, when I hear liberal democracy, I don't think Democratic Party.
Right.
You know, I think about civil rights. I think about civil liberties. I think about human rights in general. You know, I think about political parties. I think about separation of powers, right? I think about the rule of law, right? So that's here. Even, go out in the street and try to talk to Americans about liberal democracy, and you're going to get some different conversations happening. If I go out, I'm in Troy, Alabama. If I go outside and use the word liberal,
Uh-oh.
you know what I'm saying? I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
But liberal democracy this is an academic concept we're talking about. Again, let's go back even further, right? If we're going to be democratic citizens, we need to be educated, So let's take that to back to our paper. Using the word empowerment. Well, that might have a positive meaning if you come from, the United States, where empowerment means, we've moved to a situation where women can vote, right? So it has positive connotations, but that's not necessarily appropriate in Afghan culture, because in some places, and the meaning of that term empowerment, you're only empowered if somebody else loses power, right? So you have to even be careful about the concepts in which you use. It's not, that word's not regarded, here in the West, we might have more of a conceptualization of empowerment as, well, it's a win-win. I fundamentally believe that we as a society here in the United States, we have benefited from allowing women to have the right to vote. We have benefited from having more women seek political office, right? That benefits us as a liberal democracy because we've figured out a way to become a more open society where people have the ability, regardless of gender, they have the ability to have a political voice. That doesn't necessarily translate among the Afghans the same way, right? You can only be empowered at the expense of someone else. So one of the scholars we actually reference is just trying to have a different debate about the use of terms, saying, look, don't use the word empowerment, use the word enablement. But even that term itself could be misunderstood depending on the cultural context that you're in, right? So the reason I keep talking about, I keep bringing up culture is because, we have to understand that, culture doesn't the things that we accept in our culture, the things that are quote unquote norms in our culture, don't necessarily apply somewhere else. So if we're going to do female enablement or female engagement, the people that we are asking to do this work, if it's the commanders or even if it's the female soldiers that are primarily asked, hey, you're a woman, go talk to other women, well, wait a minute, I'm not trained to do that. I'm trained to find the enemy and destroy the enemy. Now, again, I will say I applaud the Department of Defense for making progress on this front. But at the same time, we need to empower our own women with the tools they need so they can go and conduct these kind of operations. Because in a place like Afghanistan, you and I can't go and engage with we can't go talk to women.
No.
I can count on one hand how many women I had a conversation with outside of the women that I worked with as part of the DOD. And I until I went into some larger towns, I didn't even see women.
Right. No. So let's real quick then talk about what it takes to be able to do that. One of the things we bring up, and we lean heavily on Benedicte Grima's work. Her last name now is Arsenault, but her work in showing us, doing an ethnography of a Pashtun woman, it took her years of going to the area, coming back and processing what she had and thinking and reading and getting smarter, and then going back out into the field. It took her years to be able to successfully integrate and understand what was really going on. These aren't quick things that you go to training for 10 days and goof around and not get there. This takes a long time. Now, granted, you don't have to take years to get there, but you have to have a mastery of Benedicte's work and being able to, not being aware of her work and attempting to engage Pashtun women is foolish, frankly.
Yeah. Well, as one of the quotes we have from one of her books is, Pashtu designates not only the language, but a particular code of behavior and values.
Right.
Right. And those are her words right there. Right. So it's not just about speaking the language, but you've got to be able to perform. You got to be able to behave in a certain way, because Pashto is not just a language. It is a system of being. And that system of being is different for men than it is for women. So what she had to do in her work was not only learn Pashto, and then she hit the ground and had to learn different dialects, right? But she had to understand that the code of behavior, like you mentioned earlier, can be different from village to village, even from tribe to tribe, family from family. The way that a woman is required to behave if she herself is going to be a Pashtun woman, right? These are very, very complex rules of behavior that are defined by, social hierarchy, that are defined by the types of connections you have, be they family or tribal, and also the level of prestige that a woman has been able to acquire in her own culture, right? We're talking about norms of behavior that extend from the way that a woman dresses, the way she reacts and acts in public, a woman's personal hygiene habits.
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner
or at JohnLG69
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
Right? The way that a woman is even supposed to conduct herself when she's bartering for goods in the market. So this is a very, very complex code of behavior that, if we're going to do these kind of operations right, then we need to figure out a way to train up to this stuff, much like we're, still able to go to the, marksmanship range and fire our weapons. And I'm hoping that we're eventually moving towards that, the ability to have that capacity and to train up to that capacity.
Yeah.
But one of the biggest things it takes, and in my opinion, I'm not just saying this because I have a bias towards education as an educator, but it takes an education, and you don't just get an education overnight. And the other thing, before you can get an education, you have to have a mind that's ready to be educated. And that in itself raises questions, because I'm not so sure that everybody is ready to be educated.
Yeah. Well, this definitely requires a different thing. And that brings us nicely to an ethos. And what is a commander's ethos? So given all of these almost this preamble of describing how complex this problem is, the dynamic of policy creep and the need for a internal focus on progress. These things are tough. What is a woman? What is empowerment? Is engagement a better word? All these other things. And then you lay that and you say, hey, commander, battle space owner, infantry guy, artillery officer,
Or it could be infantry gal nowadays.
Well,
too.
that's true for right now. From the
so maybe we're getting closer.
Yeah, the field work was done when infantry commander meant male. Yep. So, which is also incredible that we can even have that part of the conversation. But this person has a role, and they have certain things they have to accomplish, and a lot of times these things happen at the expense of other things. That's not very clear, but basically a commander has 4 things they're going to do. They're going to close with and seek and destroy the enemy, right? They're going to protect the force. They're going to teach and train the local, national police force, military, government, and then they're also going to provide enablers, guys like Rich and I, with the access they need to go do their job in the field. None of that stuff is requiring female engagement. It's all different things. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think, and I'll take us back to one of the last steps of your, like, what's a commander supposed to be doing? Before you can even get enablers into the field, There's some things you have to do, because us as enablers in the field, part of what we were doing was, if you got 5% of the population that's doing the wrong thing, and you got 95% of the population that's trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
So we were there to work with that part of the population that was doing the right thing, but also by focusing on that, and that gets us into, counterinsurgency doctrine, which I don't think either one of us want to talk about. But if we're allowed to do our work, then essentially we go back to that first part of the equation, which is I got to find and destroy the enemy. So we're actually,
which is hard, by the way. That's really hard to do.
It is very hard to do, but we might be making more enemies if we're having all these, enablers running around the battlefield doing things that they may or may not be prepared to do. And I go back to the case of the person who was trying to monitor elections simply for this is a great objective. Let's see how much participation we're getting by women. But that election monitor did not understand the first parts of that commander's mission, which is I got a war to fight that involves finding and destroying an enemy, right? But I also have to protect my force. I have to protect my soldiers. And that is, I believe, ingrained in every good commander's mind. If you're not protecting your force, then I'm not sure you can perform the other parts of your duties.
Right. No, 100%. That has to be that's elemental. The descriptions and the things, you work so hard in garrison when you're home and not deployed, because when you do deploy, you have to be ready. There's no more time to prepare. You're doing it. And that means you're training on life-saving skills, the application of your job. But what you're not training for is how to develop a capacity to engage females as a primarily male unit. So that if there are 4 tasks and one of them is provide security and access for enablers, that one line contains a whole host of things that you have to do to be able to get that done. And at some point, you run out of bandwidth in terms of training, time, and resources to get these things done. So
yeah, and and again, I'm going to give total credit to the Department of Defense for trying to move in that direction. And I can say this, and I'm speaking from experience here at Troy University. We have a lot of ROTC students, and we also have a lot of former military. We have a lot of active duty military. We have a lot of reserves and National Guard. We're a very military friendly institution. So that is a start, right? You have to have people educated. And you don't have to be that smart to learn how to operate a crew served weapon, but it takes a little bit of intelligence. But you have to have a higher level of intelligence. And if you're going to operate in the modern combat zone, modern conflict zones, where, to a great extent, you're asking people in, my old occupation, which was infantry, you're asking infantrymen to go out there and be diplomats. You have to have a higher level of education. You have to obtain a higher level of intelligence if you're going to not only know how to shoot, move, and communicate, but also be prepared to engage with those elders like you need to engage with in the modern conflict zones, or to conduct female engagement operations. But what I've seen here in the last few years that I've been at Troy University is I see very, very dedicated young men and young women who are going to be officers, right? And I will speak to the women in some of my classes because I've had several women who are going through the ROTC program. I have nothing but confidence that they are going to be able to go and operate and do the right thing in these settings. But it's not because they're women. It's because they've allowed themselves to have an education. And we encourage that. And I do think, one thing I applaud the military for doing is requiring more and more education if you're going to get promoted. And that I think is not just going to have benefits when our officers and when our enlisted personnel, ETS and, join the civilian world again. But I think it's going to have real world positive consequences for those people who are on the ground operating.
Yeah. That was powerful, man. That was good.
That was a plug from my university.
Yeah,
too.
well, you guys are doing something, and again, none of this stuff is easy. So we're giving credit because we recognize how hard this stuff is to get right and to get right repeatedly. That's the other thing.
One thing I've talked with you a lot about, and I've actually tried to, I've made some proposals, at least in working groups here, is we've got the capabilities to provide a cross-cultural competency minor program. So I went through our course catalog and I'm looking at all these classes, and I see some things that some education that we are already providing, and we could bundle this together. And then we can at least give people not a major field of study, but at least a minor. And I had in mind to try to offer this particularly to some of our ROTC students that will get deployed to foreign countries where the culture is not the same, right? And again, I keep coming back to education as a common denominator here for those people who are being asked to, put themselves in harm's way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's a powerful thing to be able to be a combatant person who has an ability to be comfortable and work within different cultures.
Yeah, because we need to be giving our commanders the capacity to train their people for this stuff. One section we have in the paper when we deal with the commander's ethos is training for cultural competency.
Right.
This is we have to be doing it to the same level that we do basic rifle marksmanship.
Yeah, funny, I agree with you on this. I guess it's probably because we wrote the same paper. Okay, let's move into the next segment of this, because we've talked about the challenges of command, and we're going to run out of time, but this is kind of how this paper is structured. All of this stuff allows us now to be in the field. We're sort of culturally competent. We know our combat tasks, but now we're going to go engage the males. And really, let's be honest about what we're talking about here. We're engaging the government. This is the cultural comfort you have to have in seeing something that you disagree with, but are like, I disagree with this, so I'm in a cultural intersection here. Let me see what I can see. The reality is the men, the tribal elders, are primarily the government, not the actual government that's been created and stood up and is being legitimized and trained, but the actual people that do the day-to-day work right now. When a baby is born, and you and I know this, who do they call? They don't call the governor. They call the Big Bob. We'll call him. They call Big Bob because he needs to know, because there's things that have to happen.
Yeah, because Big Bob wears a white turban, and he's been around for a while.
Yeah.
And Big Bob represents the informal government.
Right.
And that is the government, especially in the rural areas that you and I operated in. There's not a lot of formal government that we even know. I mean, I went on a patrol. I mean, in some parts of the meetings, some of the meetings I was in, I could still see the district governors and the district center. Uh-huh. And I'm asking people about the government, and they're like, "What government? There's no government here. The government is us."
Right.
There's self-governance that essentially has been passed down generation to generation, and again, this is from area to area. There is some self-governance there. It's informal government that we, especially coming from the United States, we might have a hard time recognizing it if we don't know what to look for. But there's a high level of self-governance, especially in Afghanistan. I saw it, but I was able to look in the right places.
You had a unique access and a different mission than everybody else had. So you're on a combat mission, but your job is to see what isn't there. And that literally is what our job was. What else is going on that we're not seeing that we need to know about? And you're saying the words, as an academician, informal government, but you also said the right word after that. But that is the government. What we see as informal, they would look at and go, no, but that's when I need help. When one of the questions I would ask is, what's the last thing the government did for you? What's the most recent thing? And they'd say nothing. Like, what's a project that they've done something, and I could make them answer the question, but I had to make them answer it. But if I was to ask the question, like, how do you guys bring in a crop? Oh, and they would tell me 1,000 things. All of the things that mattered to them, none of that had the government in it.
Yeah, well, and that's how life has been maintained for hundreds and hundreds of years in this part of the world.
Right.
So, and this is something we have to be sensitive to well-established cultural norms that we often overlook
and undermine. Like we look and say,
yes,
that's not the government.
Yeah,
but it is. When a father tells me that he has to beat his daughter to keep his family safe, I have to be able to go, I don't understand that. Help me understand that. And then still not get it until years later where I go, oh, I get it now. The performance of this abuse of your kid displays to everybody because there is no police. There's no one to call. So you have to keep your family safe by not standing out, by being the one that, hey, we're all part of the group over here. We're all in compliance. What happens behind closed doors? That's different.
Yeah, and it may not be like that forever, but we can actually hinder some political development if we're not sensitive to that. I mean, we're talking about a place, again, Afghanistan specific, but it's not the only place like this. The very means of survival is in the hands of the male elders. And that's just the actuality on the ground. That's some ground truth that I think policymakers, didn't necessarily understand. And we can disrupt the pre-existing social order if we're not careful, because social systems are built up on cultural systems, and we have to be aware of that. And we also have to acknowledge that we don't have a perfect track record here with gender relations here in the United States. And that's one thing that blows my mind. I don't understand why we have such a hard time realizing that. I mean, the women's suffrage movement was a long time ago, but in the big grand scheme of history, it was not that long ago.
Right. 100 years ago, women couldn't vote.
Yeah. Yeah. And something changed, but it took time. And you know what? Women couldn't vote, but that's because that was built upon an existing cultural system that said, all men are created equal, not women.
Right.
So we have a hard, again, this is why education is important. And part of that is understanding history. Our culture and our society here in the United States might change a bit more rapidly because we are in the modern condition. But we need to kind of step back from that if we're going to try to go and operate into places where the social order is just simply different. And it's not to say that it will never change. It can change, right? We had to allow time for us to change. When did Truman desegregate the Department of Defense? Was that 47 or 48?
I think it's 48, but don't
yeah.
That. Yeah.
Yeah, and all of a sudden we solved our race problems, right? No. That was in the late 40s. You had a deadly civil rights movements. It took people dying to have just the kind of race relations that we have today, which are not perfect by any means. Right. Another guy got shot in Sacramento, had a cell phone in his hand. Yeah. So and yes, he was an African American male. So we're not even perfect. We got our race issue, we got our gender issue, and hey, now you got a bunch of kids who are getting tired of being shot up in schools. Mm-hmm. And hey, well, wait a minute, everything should be fine because you got the right to vote when you were 18, right? But wait a minute, what was that in the 70s?
I like when you point out really awesome things like, hey, our president has a higher approval rating than our legislators. It's like, oh yeah, you want term limits? Vote those guys out if you don't like them so much, but we don't.
Yeah, well, I had to cover the executive branch in one of my national government class, and part of my bias is, why do you pay so much attention to the president? Mm-hmm. You got 3 people representing you in Congress, 1 rep and 2 senators.
Yeah.
Why don't you deal with them?
Yeah.
Because actually, the Constitution wanted them to have more power, So, well, yeah, that has since changed over time, but, I also show them the statistics when they start complaining. I was like, hey, look, you don't go out to vote.
Right.
Your age demographic does not vote, nearly as much as you should. So, but we'll see how that turns out. But getting back to our paper before we have a civics lesson here.
Right.
I'm big on understanding history, and if we can understand the problems in our own history, maybe we can give the Afghans a bit of a break here, And look, you and I have spent a lot of time so far talking about us before, and even in the paper we do this before we can even deal with the women.
On purpose, by the way.
We have to fix ourselves, and I use the word fix with air quotes around it, right? But we have to deal with some of our own issues before we can just go and make life better for women in Afghanistan.
Yeah. Yeah, this is the thing that I've learned more than anything. I spent way more time talking to and dealing with us rather than them, because if our output, from the policy to the tactics to the person on the ground, when they reach out their hand, if they're already askew, which is the norm because we don't read the books that we have to read, then how can we expect the outcome down the line even further in a more complex area to be better? In fact, that's not how these things work. So in dealing with these elders, Rich, you and I did work in trying to figure out education in Afghanistan. And we had, at this point, developed very unique and special access with a few Afghans that really opened our ability to talk to people in a way that nobody else was talking to. And so as we did this very delicately and gently, we allowed them to kind of guide us in how they wanted to approach this and put together a team of people. Not that we did it, but sat in front of these guys as they discussed it candidly about their shortcomings and what had to happen and what they needed from us. And they didn't need much from us. And a lot of what they needed was to knock it off. Stop. Don't do these things.
Yeah. Don't come to my house in a convoy.
Yeah. You're putting me on Front Street, and that makes everything bad. So
here's something from the perspective of, the keepers of the law, the male elders, again. And these are men who have been handed that by their fathers and their grandfathers, right?
Right.
So we've only got so much education materials to go around. Well, if we don't find enough education materials for all the people, the women will get shortchanged, because the male elder says, well, here in this culture, I need to educate my son so my son can go out and get a job so my son can support his family.
Right.
And that is a harsh reality. But if we're not going to have enough education materials that they distribute to all of their people, they're going to make sure that the young men get educated first, because culturally speaking, that young man has to go out and carry on his family legacy, and he can't do that if he himself isn't making children and feeding those children. So again, a harsh reality we have to accept. And, this is something you and I, were able to acknowledge even before we had the elders tell us this. But it's it was kind of hard to go back and tell the big army this actuality on the ground. They didn't want to hear it. Well, we got to get women educated. Yes, of course we do. But if you don't make sure I've got, 20,000 of these workbooks to give to the elder, well, guess what? You only gave me 3,000. Yeah. And guess what? Those 3,000 workbooks are going to go to boys and not girls.
This is a big thing, and we have to understand that. We also have to understand that these males that are the government have a lot of like if our soldiers come back, quite often with PTSD, these people don't come back. They're back. They live there already. They've dealt with it. They've been tricked. They've learned the lessons. And so as we deal with this, we can't lose sight of that, where they're not supposed to trust. They're going to do what they think they need to do to survive the next day. And really, it is hour to hour, day to day, week to week at best.
Yeah, absolutely.
We're not talking month to month. Like, this is how you survive. And introducing the concept of female empowerment and being ethical is extraordinarily challenging and not something you just race into. Because if it's important to do, it's important to do it right, even if it takes 25 years to get it right.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. There are no easy solutions here, and this is tough stuff to talk about, and it's even tougher to operate in that kind of environment. I'm can't wait for all the pushback we're going to get from some of your listeners here about this, but anybody who wants to have a intelligent conversation and not just call us names, please please reach out. I got no problem sending you a copy of the paper so you could maybe help us advance this conversation at an academic level, because
that for sure is a theme that you and I always do. Like, hey, we're going to put this out so we can have a higher level and a continued conversation, because we certainly haven't cracked the code. We don't have the magic bullet, but we're suggesting that, yeah, there's a lot of work that has to be done before we ever engage. We've almost run out of time and this is by design, not gotten to the part about what do we do when we talk to females. Because there's a lot of housekeeping that has to happen before you dare do this part.
Absolutely, and I think you had a good point a little bit earlier talking about survival, and survival is literally a minute by minute, hour to hour, day to day thing, and Afghanistan specific. I mean, it's been like that since the Soviets invaded, at least, So at least in the modern era, I mean, for the most part, the people you and I dealt with, they were very, very keen on the Soviet invasion. They remember life under the Soviets, and it's been, and then, when the Soviets left, you had, we left too, then the Taliban took over, and it was still, a battle of survival. And then we come in after 9/11 and try to make things a bit more stable. And yeah, you might have some nice buildings in Kabul that represent the government, but we've got to understand that governance is much more than a few buildings, and governance is a lot deeper than we might be seeing it's more than just face value. And when you peel back some of these layers, and I think an academic understanding of the problem first and foremost would go a long way, and not just in Afghanistan, in some of the other countries that we're probably going to get involved in the future.
Yeah, there's no doubt. The principles applied here are going to apply everywhere, whatever country we're in, wherever we're trying to create awareness. Affect, I'm going to always say this, affect is going to beat effect every day of the week. Partly because Rich and I are looking at two different elders, two different family leaders, and one guy says, if I hear anything come out of that radio that isn't education-based, I'm going to start slapping kids and taking it from them. And the other guy's like, I can't even see the radio.
She loves the music. My daughter, she loves the music. And these guys lived less than a mile away from each other.
Totally
and they were separated
different.
by a ridge line.
Right.
But they were also separated by generations and generations of what could have been a family feud or a tribal feud that we're totally unaware of, especially if we don't go there and ask the right questions, and then not just ask the right questions, but spend a lot of time listening.
Boy, spend a lot of time listening. Man, you know what? We've basically run out of time right there, and we've asked folks to listen to us for quite a while. What else do you want to say in closing, Richard? So we're going to have this paper come out. We're going to have you come back and talk about more things, but what do you want to say in closing?
Well, I'll since I just used the word listen, I will, and we're asking people to listen to us. A very, very wise person on my faculty here, somebody that I go to for professional development quite frequently. He's an anthropologist, and he's an archaeologist, and he's got his feet in both of those fields. And he told me something very smart the other day, and when I went to him for some professional development, he said, Rich, I never learned anything by talking. And that kind of, I reflected on that for a little bit, because, I did some of my best work with you, Pete, in Afghanistan, and we were listening. And that's how we did some of our best work, just by listening to people.
What did you pick up? Because you came in early on, we were able to click and get things going. And I'm going to only say this to illustrate one of the things you talked a lot about, and I'm like, you're wrong. You got to stay in the field. You always wanted to go back and check in and report and everything. And I think you found that you're right. More time in the field is where the actual work is. We still came back and did things, but what else did you pick up early on? Like, oh, this is different. I need to pay attention here. I need to listen to Pete, for example. What were some of those things that enabled you to get to where you got to so fast in terms of capability?
Oh man, I had to forget a bunch of the nonsense training that I got. I had to lose that stuff. And one thing was, and this is going back to being an infantryman, paying attention to detail. But there was another layer of that. It wasn't just, making sure my boots were tied up, it wasn't just making sure that, I had all the ammo that I needed. Wasn't making sure that, my T's were crossed and my I's were dotted, but it was paying attention to my surroundings in a way that, you do it intuitively as an infantryman, but now I wasn't doing it to the extent that I'm looking to shoot people. Right. I'm looking to close with and destroy the enemy. No, I'm actually looking to close with and figure out if I can shake this person's hand, And one thing that I really got from you early on was the notion of partnership, and that's something that, well, maybe they tried to teach us that in our very short training, but this is something that you got to be aware of. You got to partner with people. You're not just. It's part of relationship building, and you gotta have some empathy for another person's situation, and that goes a long way when you're trying to develop a partnership with someone. One thing I got from you early on was, and I wasn't ever under the mindset that I was going to deploy and write a bunch of 30-page research papers.
Right.
So that was just trying to figure out a way to get information to a decision maker in a way that decision maker can absorb that information. And I think that was one thing early on that I realized that you were interested in doing, was gathering some information so we can, make a difference. And it wasn't, let's take a month and write a paper. It's no, let's go out and let's put a 2 or 3 page research product on a commander's desk as soon as we can. And that was super valuable, and I think gave you and I some success that other people didn't necessarily have, So I think that was one thing I was appreciative of early on. Also, you had some experience that I didn't have. I was, trying to see how quick I could check my M4 out of the arms room, and as it turns out, I didn't even need that. What I needed was the ability to just go and listen to people.
Yeah.
So that's one reason why you and I clicked early on, and I think taking some of the methodologies that I had been exposed to about how to do research. That was part of my PhD training and my master's training, but then being able to overlap that on top of some of the real world experience that you had, that you had accumulated over time, I think that's what made us, quite an effective team.
Well, there you go. This is Dr. Richard Ledet. If you want to talk to Dr. Ledet, you can certainly grab his attention on LinkedIn. You can always grab me at Pete A. Turner on pretty much everything. But Dr. Rich is a little more quiet, and you got to work a little harder to get his attention. And he's a busy, busy man, but he will talk to you. So send me a note if you can't get him, but you can always find him on LinkedIn. That's a good spot. He works at Troy University in Alabama. We often write and talk and figure things out, and you are our official military/political correspondent. You teach us a lot when you come on, and I appreciate you, and you gave me the ability to add the academic element to the things that I was seeing on the ground. I was a treasure trove of raw knowledge, but we were able to hone and shape this stuff into something useful, and I'll be forever grateful for that and for our friendship that we've created. So if I have not said it recently enough, thank you very much, and I love you, Dr. Rich, for coming on the Break It Down show with me.
Well, thank you for having me, brother, and it's always a pleasure. And there aren't many people that I still talk to from back in the day, but you're one of them.
Yes.
And it's for all of those reasons, man. So, and you know, we've still got a lot of work to do. We still got a lot of papers to write. This stuff is time consuming. And hey, if you're out there listening and you got any knowledge about this stuff and you like to write, we got plenty of ideas. I tell you what, we still got to figure out how to do some academic work on dealing with our linguists and you know, putting some stuff out there about how we more effectively use our linguists. So if you're out there and you got an academic profile and you want to help expand that a bit and work with a couple guys that have been on the ground, then find us.